I'm very happy to welcome Professor Mark Regnerus in this Skype interview. He's from the University of Texas, and perhaps first you say a few things about yourself.
I've been a professor at the University of Texas at Austin for 18 years now. I came as a student of the sociology of religion, but then I transitioned to working on areas of sexuality, and now dabbling in matters of gender identity and transgender, more as a critic of the science than a real contributor yet.
Just for starters, what is gender identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different terms that we're trying to master around this stuff, but as far as I can tell, gender identity is considered a person's internal sense of being male or being female, or for some people, so a blend of both or neither, right? So the emphasis is on this inner perception of one's authentic, true self, or about deeply held feelings about one's identity in the core of one's being. So, but it's not necessarily rooted in material reality. It's rooted in this idea, psychological sense of one's gender. And the identity part kind of comes into play when you make this sort of psychological sense of self foregrounded, and it becomes like the most important sense you have about the self. Is it fixed? Is it flexible? That's all kind of up for discussion, but basically that's what gender identity is.
In English you have the word gender, but you also have the word sex. How does this fit together? I, for example, would consider myself as a person who has a Y chromosome.
Yeah, right.
Male.
So that's part of the tricky thing here, is figuring out what part language has played in the development of this. In English, we're kind of stuck with sex and gender, and different people interpret those differently. For the longest time, they've kind of been synonymous. That another way of asking a person about their sex as male or female is asking about their gender. I get that. Realistically, sort of when we think about gender roles and things like that, it's a little bit more socialized than it is biological. I mean, sex is sort of a dimorphism, biological dimorphism, as male or female, discerned by aspects of the body right down to the cellular level. Gender became kind of a synonym for that. At the same time, we also recognize that gender is more of a sort of this social aspect of being male or female, which varies quite considerably. You know, it takes me back to my childhood, which wasn't that long ago, when we all knew people who tended to act in ways that are a little bit more, men who acted in ways that were a little more feminine, or women in masculine ways, but we did not consider them the opposite sex of what they had presented themselves to be. You know, so for girls, we might call them tomboys, but we didn't think of them as real boys. So some of this is like the evolution of language attached to sort of an intellectual and sort of political movement. But really, gender has always been about the social aspect of being male or female, which is much more flexible in kind of like what we would expect of a person. You know, we can think of a very masculine man, very feminine woman, and we can think of shades of different about that. But in reality, most people sort of see the two words as the same thing. I don't think it's helpful to call them the same thing. At the same time, I don't think it's helpful to run in the direction that the sort of the gender identity movement has, of considering gender identity as entirely malleable, completely socially constructed, and subject to change.
At least my chromosomes won't change, no matter what ideology or ideas I follow.
Yeah, I mean, there are material aspects of this stuff that are stable, right? So it comes as a surprise to a lot of people, including biologists and anthropologists and plenty of medical personnel, though not all of them, that the idea that one could actually change one's sex, the mayor of London tweeted a few weeks ago that a trans man is a man, a trans woman is a woman. Like, just through the power of language, we could make something to be so, rather than sort of rely on the material reality of biology, right? So, and for decades, we've accommodated people who would kind of portray themselves as something else than, and some of them are very effective at it, right? But there's always been a sense of like, they're passing themselves off as something they are not, right? Maybe successfully, which is different than saying they are something that they once were not, right? And that this is kind of where you get the notion of the assigned at birth language. And language here is extremely important and fundamental to what's going on, because the language around being assigned male at birth lends itself to a sense of, oh, there's an external authority who's going to weigh in on this. And yet that external authority, presumably the physician who is attending at your birth, or the midwife, has the power to sort of label you as something based on observation that is then completely malleable by the self, right? At some future date. And it's even ironic that, like, I believe in New York State, you can change your birth certificate now to read the opposite sex and sort of overrule what you were observed at your birth based on will alone. So we've come a long ways from the simple notion of, oh, some people act more masculine, some people act more feminine. And now we're like, we can actually change the human person and the human body. And we don't have to do it, is the logic. We don't have to do it surgically or hormonally, although we're willing to do so, right? So some of the descriptions or the vocabulary around this in American medical associations and sociological and psychological associations, you don't have to do anything except to present yourself as something other than you were born as, for it to be considered legitimate. So there's a lot of disputation in the science here, which makes complete sense, because we're fighting over something that many of us believe fundamentally is not possible.
For most of us, this looks rather far-fetched. Where do the ideas originate from?
Right, that's a longer conversation. I'm going to have to be brief about that. Some of it around the language of gender comes back, I believe it was in the 40s or 50s. John Money was a gender scholar at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And he would deal with people who were born with disorders of presentation upon birth, right? Which is a completely different phenomenon, like born without obvious male or female genitalia, things like that. So he would experiment with sort of, well, what happens if we treat this person who was born male or had testicles were accidentally removed, or penis was accidentally removed during a circumcision, things like that. Treat them as a female or something like that. So that's kind of the origin of some of the biological stuff here, but the psychological and the social has its roots more widely in sort of gender theory, as well as queer theory, which originated in the United States, as well as France and the United Kingdom. So, and that's been around for 20 to 30 plus years. about the performativity of gender. So the roots of it are old, but they've kind of gone their own direction, and it's not like once the cat's out of the bag, like it's kind of unclear as to how and what directions it will morph. So it's morphed in the direction of in the American scientific community of believing and treating people, including adolescents and children, as something completely different than they were born as. And yet at the same time, there's this reification of gender going on. Like, oh, if this child is born a girl but acting like a boy, then we should treat it like a boy.
Treat it or him or her.
And sort of not only suggest a hormonal treatment, perhaps, because you want to do it before puberty, because then it's more effective. At the same time, like we're getting away from that older confidence that men and women, boys and girls, can act differently, and it be okay. We accommodated sort of variability in how people conduct themselves as boys and girls, men and women. And now it's almost as if, no, we're pushing people into two corners. Like, that is what men look like and act like. That is what women look like and act like. And we're willing to hormonally and surgically treat you so that you can more comfortably see yourself in one of those two corners, which I think is a profound maladaptation and a significant risk. And I don't think it fundamentally works for most people in terms of restoring psychological health. One of the things we've noticed the past 5 to 6 years is the co-occurrence of significant psychological difficulties, anxiety, depression, that come alongside the person. And then we're adding into this, like, oh, and gender identity or a transgender status can sometimes appear to young people as a response or a way out of problems. So it's like these are multiple conditions co-occurring, but the gender dysphoria is not treated as sort of another co-occurring condition, but as like the reason for those other co-occurring conditions, like depression or anxiety, and the solution is in playing into it and altering their status as by hormonal treatments and even surgical treatments. It seems dramatic overreach.
One of the fundamental concerns about gender dysphoria is the high suicidal rate. At least that is stated, and I think it has also been supported by your research. Can you comment on that, please?
Right. So it is inarguable that children and adolescents and adults with gender dysphoria are at elevated risk of depression, anxiety, and hence risk of suicide. The origins of the suicidality is, open to interpretation and some contestation. Is it something else, that some trauma that has inserted itself in this child or this adult's life? Is it an ongoing chemical imbalance or struggle in the mind over something? Or is the depression, anxiety caused by the gender dysphoria, the solution to which is to introduce these invasive treatments? Now, one of the frustrating things, I think, as an observer and as a scientist, is to see suicide weaponized in some ways, right? So the threat of this, like, if you don't do this, people will kill themselves, right? If you don't allow them to be treated by hormones or surgery, and with the sort of social transitions prior to that, if you don't do this, any sort of anxiety or depression they feel is going to be magnified, and they may end their own lives. One of the kind of standard terms is, and this is with regard to sort of a dysmorphic daughter, is that you can have a dead daughter or a living son. And parents, it's up to you. Are you going to allow them to be treated and transition, or are you going to risk the likelihood that they will end their own life? And I think that's that's a very unfortunate sort of bargain that is being made in a lot of parents and families' lives. There's no doubt that the pain is significant and the depression and anxiety are real. The question is it other people's faults? Is it the fault of the community for not treating them as they wish? Or is there some underlying event of trauma in their life through which the gender dysphoria is being played out, right? So I think the threat of suicide, which typically speaking, historically, media has been instructed wisely not to discuss this widely, because we know there's a bit of a contagion to suicide. They usually don't come in singles, usually come in sets. So it's an infectious idea. So for people who are fans of the affirmative treatment approach, to affirm and to move towards transitioning, to sort of openly use suicide as a threat, I think is hijacking kind of a more sober approach to understanding both the origins of the problem for the person in particular, the patient, and it holds hostage the scientific community and the medical community to say that this has got to be the one and only answer. Move them through affirmative treatment, or else, the blood is on your hands.
There are also people who transitioned and then retransitioned and perhaps transitioned another time. How are their experiences? Is there any science behind it? Any figures that can support your claims?
Right. It's too early to tell on this stuff. I mean, detransitioning is, we don't know how common it is. We don't know when in the sort of the biography of the patient it's most apt to occur. We do know that there are kind of cultural and social barriers to doing so at the moment, because the affirmative treatment movement per se is invested in affirming that you were not what you say you were, or you are not what you were born as. So then to do a reversal and say, whoops, we might have got it wrong, is a rather large admission, and I don't see much evidence of that. Now, only very recently have detransitioning become kind of noticed in terms of mass media. And I saw a piece in the BBC just the other day about it. And I was kind of shocked at how nonchalant the media treated this, as if, oh, this was just a sort of another phase in the autobiography of this person, rather than kind of a tragic misunderstanding and misdiagnosis in the first place. And they kind of try to downplay what has been lost permanently for some of these folks who are detransitioning. But scientifically, we do not have a ton of evidence rather than anecdotes about how large this community is, and how what they think and how they process what has happened to them.
With a high number of people transitioning and detransitioning, this is in fact very strongly rising. There will be more cases in the future for more study. But now it appears that much of this is just politically motivated. This seems to me at least a very significant part of the whole story. Perhaps you can say something about that.
Yeah, well, when I think about political motivation for this, it's not in the sort of at a sort of a partisan level necessarily, but I think politics affects how scientists approach this, the kinds of conclusions they come to, how the medical community processes this. So, for example, there was a Brown University public health researcher who was struck by what she considered the rapid onset gender dysphoria of adolescents who showed no sense of gender dysphoria in their childhood, but when they were adolescents, all of a sudden they're telling their parents that they want to be called by another name, and I think that my problem was that I'm not the sex who you think I am. So she's wanted to know, for curiosity, scientific say, how big is this community? What are they like? So she did a survey of their parents and asked them a variety of questions, and noted that there was a significant social media influence to this, a surge of social media activity by the child not long before they became dysphoric. And so it looked like there's a socially infectious aspect to this, right? So she published this in the Public Library of Science, and almost immediately there was this outcry, largely from the transgender community of activists at least, that this study is fatally flawed, etc. It is a study that has its limitations, as all studies do. But it shows you sort of how politically boxed in scientists are, right? I've done sensitive social science before, and I can tell you the power of getting in line with the status quo in your discipline is significant, and it gets your attention. And when you think of going against the grain, you have to be very prepared for the flack that can come from that. And so the university was not prepared, the journal was not prepared, and so they put the study under a re-review, which is a ridiculous thing. It didn't change the results. But what you get the sense of, what you get the sense of is that to tread in the science in this domain is to engage in very risky behavior for the scientist. And in the medical community, you think about the affirmative care, like if at your pediatric conferences, affirmative care is getting all the attention, but you're unsure as a lone pediatrician, like what do? Do you form an opposition, or do you just sort of like, well, who am I to overrule the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics? You think, well, they must know, the science must be saying, but the science here is subject to a lot of political pressure, right down to how we measure things, right? So when we used to measure things like, what is your sex, male or female? Now it's sort of, what sex were you assigned at birth? So even how we ask questions has changed. And I tell you, the power of language here is very influential, right? You ask a question like sex assigned at birth for 10 years, 15 years, and it gets into the popular imagination that sex is assigned at birth, and therefore it is to some degree malleable. So words are extremely important in all of this, and they're not neutral.
A personal question, how do you do in all of that? You must also see a lot of opposition, or are you regarded as an opponent?
Yeah, I have the first decade or so of my career, I was not making any waves whatsoever. Largely because I wasn't studying something that was considered very controversial. And then I started dabbling in relationship behavior, sexual relationship behavior, and into other territory that had lots of landmines. which I stepped on, not on purpose, but so I've become considered an opponent. In my mind, it's sort of, I approach these things through the eyes of data, right? And to me, the science of gender identity and transgender is in flux. It is not settled by any stretch. Anybody who tells you the science here is settled, the medical treatment science here is settled, is telling you something that is empirically inaccurate. And so, as a little bit of a critic, I look at the medical science around here, and I'm struck by how much the language is in talking about simple statistical significance rather than substantive statistical significance. So, for example, a study came out recently that showed, this was a Swedish study. Swedish collect excellent data from nearly in their entire population over time. So high quality data showed that hormonal treatment didn't affect subsequent use of resources for treating depression. That aspect of the study was not discussed much, and the media didn't pick it up at all. But what was discussed was the small, statistically significant effect of surgical transition on subsequent use of depression resources. But you pick through it, you look at it with a little bit of a critical eye, and the finding is so tiny and so weak. I ran a statistic called the number needed to treat, which is sort of like an assessment of how many people do you have to treat before you can expect to see good results. And it's a significant number, which means like, okay, we can do lots of different surgeries, a sequence of surgeries, typically speaking, before you should expect one additional patient to use depression resources a little less 10 years down the road. I think,
allow me to make a guess here. You were speaking about significant statistical numbers, having almost the entire population. I would say you need 1,000 or 100 cases to be statistically significant. About how many cases are we speaking here?
Yeah, no, and this particular study, if my memory serves me, if 3 or 4 cases had used depression resources a little bit less or a little bit more, I think it's a little bit more, the statistical finding would have been null, right? And so I'm thinking, you're hanging this conclusion on 3 or 4 cases that happened 10 years later, right? After the sequence of surgeries. And this becomes the root of the statistically significant claim, the substance of which, the magnitude of which is not discussed in the paper, and it's certainly not talked about in the media. So this is just, to me, it's maddening, borderline duplicitous, and certainly should at least be noted by critics.
Having a background in science, I would expect science to speak about facts, to bring about results. From this general scientific approach, is gender science at all? You mentioned it's unsettled.
Yeah, it's unsettled. There's kind of a spectrum to the science here, from the very qualitative to the very quantitative. There's a lot of scientists who would be more comfortable with the very quantitative end of this. I'd say both aspects, both sides are quite unsettled on this. I tend to focus more on the quantitative side of this. This is more where my training is. So the example I gave you about the Swedish data signals that there are demographers and medical scholars who are content to hide behind statistical significance and modest p-values, and making what may be key results that professional organizations hinge their treatment protocols upon. And I think those treatment protocols are certainly hinging at present on very unclear, modest data. This is that's Swedish studies. It's not going to get a lot better than that right now, because it's like lots of cases and looked at over 10 plus years. And if the findings are so weak over that period of time with that few of cases out of millions of Swedes, I don't see it getting any clearer anytime soon. But I think that the challenges here is like these medical communities and professional organizations have to figure out whether they're doing more damage than they're solving. But I don't think the scientists, perhaps because they are working under pressure from the affirmative treatment community, wanted to give them something to hang their hats on. I don't know that that's true, but I've spent enough time in the social scientific community to know that there are right answers, and we really would prefer if you found those right answers. So there's a good deal of pressure, I think, on social scientists and medical scientists to conclude certain things, even if those conclusions are probably not merited.
Personally, I'm quite active in social media, and I know the power of words and terms. It seems to me that many terms have been coined specifically to meet a certain ideological goal. Where do you see the power of words in this?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could to convey an appropriate sense of their very significant power of words and terms. And this goes back to the history of gender identity. And, I'll use, for example, the term cisgender. I don't know, it's probably been 10, 12 years since I first came across it, maybe a little bit more. It wasn't in popular parlance at all back then. And I'd say in the last year or two, especially the last 6 or 8 months, I've seen the term used far more consistently. Personal pronouns, that sort of thing. These notions take root, and then they become expected of people, and then to sort of object or to not go along with, you become sort of the outsider, right? There's a University of Virginia sociologist, James Davison Hunter, in a book he wrote several years ago, talked about culture as the power of legitimate naming. Culture as the power of legitimate naming. So here in the domains of gender and sexuality, which are weighted with moral significance, there's a bitter struggle going on over words and terms and the politics of using them or avoiding them. Jordan Peterson, who's probably popular over there as well as in parts of the U.S., he, his fame, at least initially, came because he didn't want to be forced to use those terms. And all the pushback that happened at the University of Toronto over all of that. So this is not just about the simple quest for better understanding a small population of people who are experiencing dysphoria about their gender. This is also about social and cultural change fostered through social science, working in tandem with scholarly activism in order to penetrate the imagination, to alter our frameworks of knowledge and discussion, alter the frameworks of discussion. So the words we use have to already be on the playing field of people who we would perhaps consider intellectual opponents. So is there any neutral way of going about this science? I'm not so sure anymore, right? It's frustrating, right? We want a genuine scientific dialogue, and I'm not sure we can have it.
Now, this refers to the intellectual community, first of all, but it has a very strong relationship also over the media to all of us. How does this affect normal people?
Yeah, so that's back to the discussion of the power of culture and the power of legitimate naming, right? So once the kind of terms trickle down from the intellectuals to the professionals to the popular parlance, then then the perception of everyday reality is start to alter, right? So you can see this kind of in the battle over, say, school textbooks and things like this, right? What kind of words are we going to use in school? What kind of words are teachers going to be using in school to talk about this? So this is a cultural project. It takes time. It takes decades. And frankly, a lot of people didn't pay any attention to this for years, right? And now they are in the past year or two, whereas the groundwork, the intellectual groundwork, has been laid for this decades ago, right? Which most of us just sort of blew off as like, oh, that's the thinking of a tiny minority. Well, that tiny minority has acquired considerable cultural power, and its influence on regular people is pronounced and getting more so. So I think once that occurs, when your average person starts using the terms and thinking in the same manner that sex is entirely malleable, and this is completely normal. It's not there's no dysfunction or dysphoric aspect about it, no disordered sense about it, then the goals of the sort of gender identity movement, I suspect, will have been accomplished.
Thank you very much, Professor Regnerus. We hope to see you then in person in fall here in Vienna to hear more about you about this important subject.
Right. I certainly wish I could have been there. Sounds like I would have had to have a quick meeting and turn around and come home to avoid all this coronavirus chaos that's raining down on us of late. So I look forward to seeing you later this year.
We'll spread your news virus-free. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.